Preview.
President Donald Trump, who has been ensconced at his resort in Bedminster, New Jersey, and British Prime Minister Theresa May, who is on holiday in northern Italy, have been enjoying some vacation of late. But, from what neither has engaged in an arduous program of legislation or policy-making during their brief stints in office. Instead, they strut their stuff and make proclamations of intent, chiefly aimed at whipping up enthusiasm among their core supporters. Trump and May appear to represent a new type of non-governmental leadership, in which the occupant of the highest office proves astonishingly ineffectual or, worse, indifferent when it comes to the actual business of governance, of devising policy and legislating to take society forward. And while the diminishment of government may placate the deepest resentments of those who elected them, we should realize that this may not be a passing phase. Benevolent democratic government, and its capacity for rough compromise, could be impaired forever. Trump's anti-government impulse is more profound than his general inclination to subvert the Secretary of State, or Secretary of Defense, for advice from his son-in-law. It is even more profound than his unfulfilled promise, from before his election, to initiate key legislative measures, the repeal of Obamacare, the Illegal Immigration Act, tax reform, and an act to drain the swamp, among others, during the first 100 days of his administration. After 200 days in office, Trump does not appear to give one solitary damn about forging an administration of the 575 key policy-making positions that he is duty-bound to fill. The Senate has confirmed only around 50 nominees. He has been markedly slow on a further 600 appointments that also need Senate approval. Some might argue that America is better off without Trump creating a blizzard of damaging legislation, but this misses the point. Trump's presidency is much more about communicating with his supporters than actually governing. Why would he bother with the homework of filling scores of jobs when he can hang out at his golf resort and make chilling fire and fury threats, which are aimed as much at his supporter base as at Kim Jong-un? After all, the notion of the golf course president, one untrammeled by tedious responsibilities, is what his supporters want, and may explain why the Nazi fringe of his constituency has adopted the clubhouse uniform of khaki pants and white shirts. Trump's inability to condemn the white supremacy march on Charlottesville over the weekend is a worrying indicator of the way things are likely to develop when the president appears to care less about the norms of government than fomenting a dangerous feedback loop between himself and extreme racists. Across the Atlantic, May's administration may not be nearly as frightening, but there is a strikingly similar failure of government. To refresh my memory of the past dispiriting year in British politics, I went through the weekly calendars of parliamentary business since the Brexit referendum in June 2016. Among all the parliamentary statements, motions, and debates, there is really only one major piece of legislation, the Investigatory Powers Act, commonly known as the Snoopers Charter, which codified the toughest surveillance regime in the West. Otherwise, the sound and fury in the chamber of House of Commons amounted to nothing. May presides over a parliament that is, to all intents and purposes, legislatively comatose, the more so since she lost her overall majority in the spring general election. I cannot remember a more lackluster performance. This new trend in non-government appeals to many who argue that a nation can do perfectly well without hyperactive governments, like the one led by Tony Blair, which achieved the extraordinary feat of creating 3,000 new crimes, nearly one for every day he was in office, during his decade in power. Things now appear to be superficially okay in both countries. The markets seem optimistic and employment statistics are good. And it is certainly true that societies on both sides of the Atlantic are capable of gradual self-improvement without new laws telling people exactly how to behave, as has been the case with LGBT rights and the steady fall in crime. The important point is that there are millions of people in the US and UK who no longer trust their political elites in DC, Westminster, and Brussels, and in effect voted to degrade their power. Non-government is what they voted for, whether they were conscious of wanting it or not. It is important to recall how we got here. But, let's first try a thought experiment and replace Barack Obama with Trump in the White House in the winter of 2009. The collapse of the housing market, which created the greatest economic recession since the Great Depression, required urgent action on many fronts. During Obama's first 6 months, he signed into law the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, approved sending 17,000 troops to Afghanistan, and announced a new approach in Iraq. He submitted his proposed budget to Congress, with cuts of $17 billion, and began the tough process of reshaping and saving America's auto industry. Obama moved into the White House with clear policy priorities and a very good idea of whom he wanted among his team. He prepared for government and hit pressing domestic and foreign problems as quickly as he could. Now, imagine if Trump were faced with those same problems, coming, as he did, to the White House without any kind of detailed program, or coherent thought in his head longer than 140 characters, and, as importantly, without a team of people who knew how to generate workable policy, negotiate with Congress, get things done and communicate the White House's decisions to a concerned U.S. public that faced foreclosures and job losses. If Obama had been playing as much golf as Trump claimed, and, indeed, he himself has played in the first 6 months of office, it seems likely none of this would have happened. It is with good reason that Senator Lindsey Graham recently told his constituents, "Sorry, the government is so screwed up. We're working on it." Non-government is a luxury of relatively tranquil times in the United States, and it cannot last. In his new book, The Lure of Greatness, the British writer Anthony Barnett reminds us that both the Leave and Trump campaigns encouraged the public to believe that they were liberating themselves by taking back control. Instead, he writes, Theresa May insists on unforgiving presidential power, while Trump seeks to turn the presidency into a dictatorship. Both will turn the jailbreak that propelled them to power into a lockdown. Barnett continues with an exhortation that we should build a democracy and economy that is wiser, more thoughtful, open and honest. That is true, and we must hope it is possible, but it is hard not to wonder whether America and Britain, which have both tasted unchallenged domination in the last 200 years, and have claimed an exceptionalism, have moved into the age of decadence that is chillingly defined by the environmentalist and thinker William Ophuls in his essay A Moderate Greatness: Why Civilizations Fail. Frivolity, aestheticism, hedonism, cynicism, pessimism, narcissism, consumerism, materialism, nihilism, fatalism and fanaticism suffuse the population, Ophuls writes. Politics is increasingly corrupt, life increasingly unjust. A cabal of insiders accrues wealth and power at the expense of the citizenry, fostering a fatal opposition of interests between haves and have-nots. This will all be very familiar to Americans and the British. An evening spent flipping through TV channels in either country will supply good examples of that entire list. On consumerism, it is worth noting that both nations are indulging in an epic spending spree. American household debt has just exceeded the previous high of 2008 with a $12.7 trillion burden, and, in Britain, personal debt has increased by 10% while incomes rose by just 1.5% in the same period. This is insane behavior in a country that, after Brexit, faces the gravest economic crisis in generations. The two nations have much else in common that may explain the sudden descent of government. Our democracies are the oldest in the world, and unlike most of the member states of the EU, we have no memory of authoritarian regimes and the consequent loss of personal freedom. We assumed that the kind of breakdown represented by non-government only happens outside the Anglophone world and that freedom is somehow part of our genetic inheritance. In both countries, the center ground of politics has yielded the agenda to identity politics and obsessions about self-expression. These issues are not bad in themselves, but consider a few objective priorities of our time: climate change, unsustainable inequality, the exhaustion of the world's resources, the extinction of species, aging populations, and the impacts of automation and artificial intelligence. In Britain, these are now barely touched on by politicians, certainly not by the Brexit-obsessed government. In the U.S., the president concedes no items of this list. It's striking that both administrations focus on targets that are so narrow and negative. Those who supported Brexit and Trump insisted they were voting for positive messages, taking back control of their country, for instance, and making America great again. But the impetus of the populist surge was, in truth, largely negative and reactionary: to stop immigration, to impede trade, to limit cooperation and cultural exchange, to stop all the rapid developments that made people fearful and threatened their jobs. Reflecting the pessimism and nostalgia of its supporters, non-government leadership produces no new ideas or solutions and instead proposes unenlightened regressiveness, a culture of exclusion, a culture of no that challenges the founding belief of Western liberal democracy, which is that with hard work, ingenuity and the hard compromise of government can improve things. Without optimism, governments submit to fatalism, and fail. Compare the complexity of our societies with the crudeness and limitations of the May government and Trump administrations and you know that this state of affairs will not continue for very long. The world moves too fast and becomes more intricate and connected by the day. Crises will emerge from nowhere and developments, like automation and AI, are going to force rapid change that those in power are ill-equipped to deal with. Their very best defense, when confronted with something overwhelming, is to deny its existence. Reality will certainly bite. It is already beginning to in Britain where, just over 13 months after the referendum, the country now has the worst performing economy of the 27 other nations in the EU, and the pound is confidently predicted by Morgan Stanley to fall below the euro, a dramatic symbol of failure if ever there was one. The cost of living rises, banks withdraw from the City of London, tech workers, academics, engineers slowly migrate from the UK, or are simply not coming, as is the case with foreign nurses needed by Britain's National Health Service. And what does the non-government do in these circumstances of obvious calamity? It chants the empty mantra Brexit is Brexit and behaves as though Britain were still a great imperial power. It is as humiliating as watching Trump's gormless pronouncements on the world stage. This is all very depressing, but there are clear rays of hope. Both nations have deep reserves of decency and value systems, which will be offended by the way things are going. The inadequacies of our two governments will soon be accepted by the majority, for after promising so much they are failing a basic test of competency. It is worth remembering that Brexit and Trump only ever gained the support of highly motivated minorities. Trump lost the popular vote last November by more than 2.5 million, and his approval rating stands well below 40%. In Britain, just 27% of the population, 37% of the electorate voted to leave the EU last year, and there is now a consensus among opinion polls that a Brexit referendum held today would be won by the Remain side. Meanwhile, May's satisfaction rating has seen a fall of 60 points since her botched election campaign. Despite the events of Charlottesville, I believe we are experiencing a relative calm before an inevitable storm that will result from the limitations and irresponsibility of non-government. May and Trump are unlikely to react well or democratically to crisis. May is already seeking to make laws without consulting Parliament, and it is hard to imagine Trump heeding any institution, even one which is packed with his own party. It is no exaggeration to suggest that our democracies may depend on the response to the debasement of government by the reasonable, fair-minded majority on both sides of the Atlantic.